A severed head may stay conscious for as long as 30 seconds following decapitation, a grotesque final half-minute during which the eyes could still blink, the lips may move as if to speak, and awareness lingers even as life slips away. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII and perhaps the most renowned beheaded queen in history, this chilling possibility was only one part of an execution that later retellings often gloss over. The real account of Anne's final moments uncovers a psychological torment far more harrowing than a single stroke of the blade, a meticulously staged political performance aimed at destroying not just her body but her memory as well. Anne's execution serves as a stark symbol of the ruthlessness embedded in Tudor England's justice system, where death itself was merely the final piece in a deliberately engineered humiliation. Though most history books simply record her death as punishment for treason, the truth of her last days reveals a process of emotional destruction so precise it could rival the techniques of today's most effective torturers. Her beheading was not simply a conclusion, it was the last step in Henry VIII's deliberate plan to wipe out a woman who had become too influential for his liking. By the time May 19, 1536 arrived, Anne Boleyn had already spent 17 days imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had once prepared to ascend the throne. Merely 3 years earlier, she had been crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now she found herself suspended in a torturous uncertainty, her execution delayed multiple times as Henry VIII extended her psychological suffering. The king even arranged for a skilled swordsman from Calais to carry out the execution instead of relying on the traditional English axe, a detail frequently portrayed as a kindness but in reality only reinforced the performative nature of her death. In her final hours, Anne displayed a strange serenity, described by onlookers as almost cheerful even while facing the end. Today's psychologists might interpret this as disassociation, a mental mechanism activated by severe emotional distress. She is said to have joked that she would soon be called Anne sans tête, or Anne without a head, a grim form of humor concealing deeper fear. Few historical narratives fully capture the terror she must have experienced, knowing that her legacy was being systematically dismantled by false claims of adultery, incest, and plots to kill the king. What renders Anne's death especially unsettling isn't just the brutal act of beheading itself, but the deliberate destruction of her identity. Henry sought more than her death. He aimed to erase her completely, to invalidate her influence, and to undermine her daughter Elizabeth's right to the throne. Her execution was the final act of a campaign to ruin her character in the eyes of the public and justify her downfall. By the days leading her death, Anne was forced to endure vile, invented stories of supposed sexual misconduct, allegations so implausible they would be thrown out by any court today. The morning of May 19th broke with an unusually clear sky over London, a stark contrast to the grim events about to take place. Anne had spent her last night in prayer, though sleep had continually escaped her. Tower records reveal she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m., kneeling before the host for hours in desperate spiritual communion. By sunrise, she had already been without rest for nearly an entire day, her mind likely unraveling under the weight of stress and fatigue. When the lieutenant of the tower arrived to escort her, she was reportedly laughing with her attendants, a reaction that pointed not to serenity but to psychological collapse. Anne's execution had been set and postponed multiple times, a frequently ignored form of mental torment. The constant uncertainty of when the end would come was a calculated method used to break prisoners down. When she was finally told the moment had come, Anne was led from her quarters through the same passageways where just 3 years earlier she had walked as a queen in waiting. Now, soldiers accompanied her not out of honor, but to prevent any attempt to flee. And those same courtiers who had once bowed before her now observed her final steps with cold detachment. The scaffold built on Tower Green was unusually low, rising only 3 feet off the ground, in contrast to the tall stages often shown in movies. This intentional design meant Anne had to climb only a few steps, denying her the dignity of elevation and placing her within arm's reach of the mocking spectators. While modern portrayals often depict a somber, respectful audience, historical accounts suggest the scene resembled a fairground, a deliberately cultivated mood. The execution served as public drama, a stark warning to anyone who might defy the king, especially women who dared to rise above their assigned role. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was allowed a final statement, not out of compassion but because ceremony required it. Her words, carefully chosen, reflected both her sharp political mind and the desperation of her position. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." This seeming acceptance of her fate was in truth her last form of defiance. By acknowledging the law without confessing guilt, she quietly questioned the legitimacy of the charges brought against her. Perhaps most chilling was the king's absence. Unlike the commonly portrayed image of royal executions, Henry VIII was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he remained at Whitehall Palace waiting to be told Anne was dead. Even as the blade ended her life, Henry was said to be celebrating his coming marriage to Jane Seymour, a cruel reflection of how thoroughly Anne had been cast aside. The personal had been overtaken by the political, and Anne's death was merely a bothersome requirement in the king's relentless quest for a male successor. The swordsman summoned from Calais, personally requested and generously compensated for his skill, introduced yet another layer of deliberate cruelty. Typical English executions employed an axe, which often took multiple strikes to fully sever the head. The French swordsman, though more likely to carry out the decapitation in one clean motion, was a stranger to Anne. In her last moments, she would face death delivered by an unfamiliar hand, a final humiliation for a queen who had once captivated an entire nation. Her blindfold, often portrayed as an act of compassion to shield her from the sight of the weapon, actually served a more functional purpose. It prevented her from instinctively recoiling, which might have caused a botched execution. Anne knelt upright rather than resting her head upon a block, a French custom that added complexity for the executioner. This position demanded that Anne hold herself steady purely through mental resolution, preserving her poise as the sword was readied. Observers noted that her lips moved in constant prayer, and her eyes, hidden beneath the blindfold, flicked back and forth as she strained to catch the slightest sound of the approaching blade. The psychological anguish of that moment, the certainty of death combined with the uncertainty of timing, stands as a form of torment rarely acknowledged in the more polished versions of history. By Tudor standards, the execution itself was remarkably precise. A single strike severed Anne's head, but what followed is often excluded from sanitized historical records. Eyewitnesses claimed that her eyes and lips continued to move for several moments after the blow, a chilling physiological reaction caused by residual oxygen in the brain. Some even reported her lips shaped words, perhaps finishing the prayer cut short by the sword. The scene was so ghastly that multiple onlookers fainted, while others averted their gaze in horror at this haunting display of the fragile line between body and soul. Perhaps most revealing of all, no proper coffin had been arranged for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, overwhelmed by grief and shock, had to hurriedly find an arrow chest in which to place her head and body. This seemingly small detail speaks volumes about the utter disregard shown for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was treated as little more than a logistical issue, a political inconvenience resolved, not a person worthy of ritual or honor. She was quickly laid to rest in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel, without any formal Christian rites, as though the king intended her memory to vanish as swiftly as her life had ended. Henry's effort to obliterate Anne extended well beyond her execution. Court artists were instructed to destroy her portraits. Her personal insignias were scraped off palace walls, and courtiers quickly realized that speaking her name could bring royal disapproval. Although we often concentrate on the physical act of execution, the systematic erasure of Anne's identity reflects a form of violence that surpassed her death, an effort to annihilate not just a woman, but a legacy. It would take generations before historians would begin the careful task of piecing together Anne's story from the fragments that managed to survive Henry's purge. Anne's execution also left lasting psychological scars on those compelled to witness it, especially her ladies-in-waiting, who were tasked with cleaning and preparing her severed head for burial. These women, themselves fearful of being associated with the Queen's supposed offenses, had to carry out this gruesome duty while maintaining their composure. Several were said to be plagued by nightmares for years afterward, and at least one eventually withdrew to a convent, unable to continue court life after the trauma she had endured. The aftershocks of this psychological horror extended well beyond Anne, fostering a climate of dread that settled over Henry's court for the remainder of his rule. Immediately following the execution, Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and stripped from the line of succession. The child destined to become England's most iconic queen was in effect orphaned, her mother executed, her father publicly disavowing her legitimacy.
Court records indicate that Elizabeth was suddenly left without proper attire or attendants fitting her previous rank. Her household was dismantled almost instantly. This heartless treatment of a toddler adds yet another layer to the brutal consequences surrounding Anne's fall. The punishment extended even to her blameless child. Modern portrayals of Tudor executions often fail to convey the overwhelming sensory onslaught. The scaffold would have stunk of blood from past deaths, swarming with flies in the warm May air. The uproar of the crowd, stirred up by strategically placed supporters ordered to cheer the Queen's death, created a deafening wall of noise designed to confuse and terrify. Anne would have heard this rising din as she approached Tower Green, the taunts and abuse from a public trained to see her as a sorceress and a traitor. This meticulously staged public degradation was a key component of Tudor justice. Death alone was never considered punishment enough. Popular narratives frequently idealize Anne's final words as a moment of noble defiance, but historical sources suggest a more complex picture. Her deliberately phrased speech, in which she referred to the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, reflects the impossible situation she faced. Even staring down execution, Anne could not speak her mind. Her words were shaped by fear for her daughter's future and the unpredictable response of the gathered crowd. Her speech stands not as an act of free expression, but rather its denial. The ultimate silencing of a woman who knew her last words would be carried back to the king and might endanger those she left behind. The sword that brought Anne's life to an end, specially brought in from France, embodied the theatrical nature of her death. Henry spared no effort or cost to produce a spectacle befitting the downfall of a queen. The executioner, it is said, rehearsed on animals beforehand, intent on delivering the single, precise strike that would justify his generous payment. This clinical efficiency, the reduction of Anne's death to a logistical execution, epitomizes the dehumanization embedded in state-directed killings. Anne wasn't simply put to death. She was funneled through a mechanism intended to convert personal agony into political theater. Contemporary sources note that no English headman would take on the task, not due to moral hesitation, but because the French method of sword beheading required expert technique. The sword itself was finely honed and differently balanced from the English axe, crafted for a swift lateral cut rather than the vertical chop customary to axe executions. This technical nuance reinforces the performative essence of Anne's death. Even the manner of execution was deliberately chosen for dramatic effect and minimal disorder, ensuring the grim show would proceed smoothly without the grisly aftermath of a failed beheading. After the blade struck, witness Thomas Wyatt, then a prisoner in the Tower and forced to observe the death of a woman he had once admired, wrote of the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it. His elegiac remark captures the grotesque transformation of Anne from ornamented sovereign to lifeless object. The detached head was quickly swathed in cloth by her sobbing attendants, but only after the executioner lifted it by the hair, a customary gesture meant to affirm to the crowd that justice had been carried out. This macabre display, with blood still streaming from the neck, provided the final image intended to sear itself into the memory of those present. Tower documentation reveals that Anne's burial was executed with such haste that formal Christian rites were truncated almost entirely. The arrow chest containing her body and head was interred beneath the chapel floor alongside other nobles who had met similar fates, a shameful conclusion for a once crowned Queen of England. No memorial marked the gravesite, and for centuries her precise resting place remained a mystery. This obliteration of even her burial location signaled the endpoint of Henry's effort to expunge Anne not only from life but from the historical record, an effort that came dangerously close to succeeding. In the aftermath of her execution, Henry's propagandists labored intensely to steer public opinion. Court poets who had once extolled Anne's charm and intellect now composed lines branding her a manipulative adulteress. Official versions of events emphasized the king's supposed compassion in selecting a professional swordsman over the standard axe, recasting Henry's spectacle-driven decision as an act of thoughtful mercy. The brutality of the execution gradually whitewashed in official chronicles, launching the long tradition of historical distortion that continues to shape modern interpretations of Anne's final hours. Perhaps most chilling to contemporary minds is how seamlessly life resumed for Henry VIII. On the very next day following Anne's death, Henry became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within a fortnight of executing his second wife, Henry wedded his third in a subdued ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This ruthless pace exposes the execution as nothing more than a pragmatic resolution to a dynastic obstacle. Anne's inability to deliver a male heir sealed her fate. She was cast aside and replaced. Her deeply personal demise was wholly overshadowed by the machinery of power and political ambition. The psychological toll of Anne's execution extended well beyond the scaffold itself. For weeks leading up to her death, she was subjected to incessant interrogations, deprived of adequate sleep, and cut off from allies. Thomas Cromwell, the king's principal minister and architect of the charges against her, employed methods strikingly akin to present-day psychological torture. Sensory disruption, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the calculated use of misinformation. By the time Anne reached the scaffold, she had already undergone a sustained campaign of psychological erosion intended to eliminate any possibility of defiant final words. Court documentation details the extraordinary security protocols put in place for Anne's execution, far exceeding the norm, even for high-profile traitors. The tower's garrison was doubled, and additional guards were stationed throughout the fortress. These precautions weren't aimed at preventing escape, but at ensuring no loyalists could make a last-minute rescue or stir up public opposition. This overwhelming show of force also served a secondary function, sending a chilling message to anyone who might privately mourn Anne or question the king's justice. The execution was deliberately timed for late morning rather than the customary dawn, to allow for the largest possible audience from London. Tower Green itself held only a select gathering of nobles and officials, but the tower's elevated position ensured that the crowd outside could hear the announcement once the act was completed. Church bells ringing across London would signal the Queen's death, creating a citywide moment of royal affirmation. This orchestration turned Anne's personal agony into a carefully staged spectacle. Death not as intimate loss, but as a calculated display of sovereign authority. One of the most frequently neglected elements of Anne's downfall is the fate of the 5 men accused alongside her. Among them was her own brother, George Boleyn, all executed days before Anne on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths were designed to establish the validity of Anne's supposed crimes before she herself was brought to the scaffold, preempting any potential contradiction in their final remarks. This coordinated legal extermination of 6 individuals, all condemned based on virtually identical fabricated allegations, stands as one of Tudor England's most egregious episodes of state-sponsored brutality, bearing eerie resemblance to Stalin-era show trials. Though a modern memorial now marks the supposed location of Anne's execution on Tower Green, historical records suggest the scaffold actually stood elsewhere within the Tower grounds. This geographic ambiguity reflects a broader tendency to reinterpret and reframe Anne's execution across time, both physically and historically, to suit changing narratives. The romanticized, sanitized versions portrayed in contemporary media bear little resemblance to the mental torment, public disgrace, destruction of reputation, and efforts to erase her altogether that defined her final days in May 1536. What renders Anne Boleyn's execution truly harrowing is not only the physical act of decapitation, but the understanding that it was the culmination of a meticulous campaign to annihilate a woman who had ascended too far beyond what Tudor society deemed acceptable. She wasn't simply put to death, she was deliberately dismantled. Her name smeared, her accomplishments invalidated, her existence nearly purged from collective memory. When we view her final days in full context, the mental degradation, public disgrace, theatrical staging, and deliberate suppression of her legacy, we are confronted with a horror more unsettling than the swift stroke of a French blade. From a modern psychological lens, Anne's execution emerges as a textbook example of state-sanctioned gaslighting and character destruction. Her accusations against her, from adultery with multiple men, including her brother, to plotting to poison the king, were so implausible they would collapse under scrutiny in any contemporary court. Yet through calculated propaganda, coerced testimonies from tortured co-defendants, and total control of official accounts, Henri's regime successfully convinced much of the public that Anne's death was justified. This manipulation of collective perception may be the most chilling element of all. Half a millennium later, Anne Boleyn's execution still captivates because it reflects the fusion of personal devastation with political maneuvering. Her death was not simply the loss of a life, it was a deliberately orchestrated performance intended to rationalize a monarch's decision and reshape how history would remember both him and her.
The deepest terror lies not in the moment the blade fell, but in the realization of how thoroughly absolute power can distort reality. It's a lesson that continues to echo in today's world of media control and character destruction. Anne's ultimate tragedy may be that, despite the king's efforts to erase her entirely, it was her death, not her life, that endured in the historical record. To fully grasp the horror of Anne Boleyn's execution is to confront disquieting truths about the mechanics of power, the role of gender, and the ways historical narratives are crafted. The tidy portrayal of her end, a wronged queen meeting a swift and dignified death, conceals the systemic abuse of power that her fate represents. By examining the mental torment, public disgrace, destruction of reputation, and efforts to erase her altogether, we uncover not only the reality of Tudor justice, but the broader mechanisms by which authority enforces control over both human lives and the stories told about them. In Anne's severed head, we see not just tragedy, but a warning of how easily truth itself can be undone by power.